Antic.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. And I might start by perhaps just expressing my gratitude for Senator Eyre's contribution this afternoon. I very much enjoyed it. He delivered it very well, and like all great acts of fiction, it entertained me, much like Homer's The Odyssey or The Grapes of Wrath or Gone with the Wind. It was very much a journey into the land of the untrue. So it is important, I think, at this point to speak to the motion, Senator Gallagher's motion, which is, I suppose, important at this stage to point out what I consider to be the flawed nature of the motion in itself. And in fact, one would have to say that one would quite comfortably reject the very basis upon which the motion was framed, because, quite frankly, what it's seeking to do is muddy the waters in relation to the government's performance in a fairly typically disingenuous way that we've seen from our friends in the Australian Labor Party across the way. The truth of the matter is, Acting Deputy President, that the Morrison government hit the ground running following May 2019's election win. And the fact is that this government has been prosecuting arguments for good government since 2013. And this is a fact which clearly is not getting through to those on the other side. This government has been delivering real results for Australians. It's been consistently delivering on key issues for our country, and it's topical at this stage to review some of the more recent achievements that this government has been able to deliver. And I think that certainly gives a point of distinction between the criticism that we see in this motion, which in my view is quite unfounded. We've had delivery of defence projects. We've had the efforts in relation to the bushfire recovery, which, it needs to be said, is really the only unprecedented thing about this bushfire, has been the extraordinary manner in which the government has responded and has mobilised. We've seen the drought relief project and the government ably managing what has been an extraordinarily difficult period of time in this country's history in relation to drought. Infrastructure project after infrastructure project, Mr Acting Deputy President. And this government ultimately won't be dissuaded by criticism of this nature. It has a plan for what is already a strong economy becoming an even stronger economy. And this government will do that by continuing to lower taxes, by continuing to reduce costs for families, costs for businesses, energy costs, by continuing its program of deregulation, equipping Australians with skills, expanding our trade borders, building infrastructure and overall keeping our budget strong. All of this in the face of global economic headwinds and what has been a devastating summer in the last few months. It has been a devastating summer for Australians facing this bushfire crisis. And that's why this government has committed to doing whatever it takes to get Australian families and businesses, towns and communities back on their feet. And the Morrison government is doing all of this without taking reckless risks to our economy and to this country's way of life. And we know, of course, that that certainly would not have been the case had the Australian people elected a Labor government, and indeed a Labor government specifically under Bill Shorten at the last election. This would have been a complete and utter disaster for this country, particularly knowing what we now know about the challenges we face. And there's no better way to confirm this than to look at the government's approach in relation to, for example, emissions. Australia's emissions fell 1% in the 18-19 financial year, and it's instructive to note that they are now lower than when the coalition government came into power, and at their lowest level since 2015 to 2016. They're lower than any other year Labor was in power. And Australia is now a world leader per capita in investing in clean energy, with more than double the investment of countries who claim a particular expertise in that area, such as the United Kingdom, Germany and France. And it's an achievement of which this government and all Australians can be proud. Because this government, at the end of the day, is not going to be bullied into ruining our economy. these measures confirm that this government takes a balanced and responsible approach to its role, not the reckless, crazy mechanisms of the Australian Labor Party, the spendthrift nature of the Australian Labor Party, or worse yet, the sorts of catastrophes which would be inflicted on us by the Australian Greens. We've recently seen this government react in, as I've already said, what is an unprecedented manner, with a compulsory call-out of ADF reserve brigades in bushfire-affected communities. This is an action which has never been seen before, with 6,500 Army personnel, including 3,000 reservists, called up. Now, that is no easy task, and it is an absolute credit to the people of the ADF and the department. This government's recently announced the establishment of the National Bushfire Recovery Agency, delivering alongside an initial $2 billion of funding to support recovery. And ultimately, Mr Acting Deputy President, it is instructive once again to note that these are the sorts of measures that this government has prepared for by way of its incredibly diligent management of this economy and the budget. These are the sorts of measures which simply would not be achievable had the economy not been managed in the way it was. Money does not grow on trees, and this government's respectful and considered approach to financial management and prudential financial management is the reason we are able to spend the sorts of monies we are in these times of need. Had the Labor Party taken office in May last year, we would almost certainly have been hit with a drought tax and a bushfire tax and a whole host of other taxes, in addition to Bill Shorten's proposed $387 billion of taxes across the board. This would have been an absolute disaster. This government has stopped the boats and is keeping our borders secure. It's cancelled the visas of over 4,400 foreign nationals who would potentially have committed serious crimes. We're talking about serious criminals, murderers, rapists and sex offenders of all sorts. So this government does not take the criticism lightly. We will continue to defend Australia, its economy, its values and ultimately our way of life. If one was to sit down and list the achievements of this government in the time, and particularly the Morrison government, and the government which ultimately is the subject of criticism this afternoon by way of this motion, we would certainly, Mr Acting Deputy President, be here a very, very long time. But it is instructive once again to note some of those very significant achievements and milestones. And one of the most significant was the August 2018 conclusion of negotiations between Australia and Indonesia in terms of the Economic Partnership Agreement in Jakarta, which is a significant trade deal. We've seen this government deliver the national apology to victims and survivors of institutional child sex abuse in October of that year. We've seen the announcement of a $5 billion future drought fund and the drought summit, which I've touched on earlier today. This government's cut $300 million over the next 4 years' worth of red tape in relation to small and medium-sized businesses, which, once again, I've touched on earlier in relation to the role this government has played in deregulation. $1.25 billion in community health and hospitals program in my home state of South Australia. Also, in December of 2018, in my home state of South Australia, this government announced Australia's space agency to be located in Adelaide at Lot 14 in the city of Adelaide, which will, of course, be an enormous driver of economic activity in my home state and my home city. We've seen in February of 2019 a $662 million aged care package to support older Australians. The Adelaide City deal was signed in March 2019 to tie in with the aforementioned Australian Space Agency, of which I just spoke of. This government has taken road safety initiatives, $2.2 billion to boost road safety countrywide. Across the board, there have been achievements. In March of 2019, this government introduced tough new laws to prevent the weaponising of social media platforms to protect Australians from live streaming of violent crimes. The list goes on and on and on. A crackdown on social media platforms, online predators in May of 2019, prior to the election. And we've seen in this very, very last portion, oily portion I should say, of the year, as I said earlier, the announcement of the Australian Bushfire Recovery Agency. We've seen the support for affected communities in South Australia, which has been unprecedented in difficult times, Mr Acting Deputy President. My home state of South Australia has been dramatically affected by the bushfire, in particular Kangaroo Island, which is a very special place for South Australians. This government in January of this year announced additional support for fire-affected communities, providing grants of up to $10,000 for small businesses and $15,000 to primary producers. The list goes on and on, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, so I would resume my seat.